Okay, so welcome to today's video about Orientalism and gender. This is part one of a larger lecture that I decided to split this up a little bit because I know you don't want to watch, because of the quality of these videos, I know you don't want to watch something that's an hour and a half. So I'm going to break it up. I'll try to do this one as quickly as I can. It'll probably be about 45 minutes. I'll see. But then I'll post this part two before Wednesday about Doreen Condo's article. So today will just be about Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, which is a really good. It's as good an example of post-structuralist social science as there is. It's definitely one of the more famous ones because it caused quite the stir in 1978 when it came out. But it's just a really important concept. Keep in mind as I talk about this that it doesn't have to. These ideas don't just apply to social sciences about what we used to call the Orient, like East Asia, the Middle East, India, places like that. I'll talk about that later. But it also can be applied to some of the things that you saw in the video about race, right? Some of the same ideas we used to talk about Native American communities. We're talking about African Americans, and on and on. It's just basically the point of Said's work was that you can't separate these things that the West thinks it knows about these other places from the power relationships that undergird the production of that knowledge. So you might want to go back and look at your Foucault post-structuralism notes. You might want to go back and look at Stuart Hall, just to think about how this idea that knowledge is inseparable from power. So I'm just going to jump in, and then I'm going to end this with a 6-minute video from Suk Jali about. It's an interview with Edward Said, who passed away about 10 years ago, I think. So, okay, so I'm just going to jump in from there. So the next video I post will be about Kondo's work. So in Kondo's work, she uses Said's concept, Orientalism, which I'll explain shortly, to analyze David Henry Hwang's play in Butterfly. And as you can see here on the left, this is from a still from a stage version. The most famous version had John Lithgow in it, so you would recognize. So it's still being performed. And you'll see in that next lecture that in Butterfly is a rewriting of one of the most famous Orientalist texts ever, which was Madama Butterfly, which is always performed. It's a famous opera. It's probably the most famous opera ever. And so David Henry Hwang was a LA-based playwright, LA-based Asian American playwright who used the framework of Orientalism to really pick apart this original opera and kind of give it a spin. And I won't talk about it now because it's really interesting. I won't talk about it now. I'll talk about it in the next lecture. But Kondo's book has a chapter about about Hwang's project, and that's the chapter that I gave you on Beachboard. So today I'm just going to talk about the ideas that Said came out with Orientalism, which was published in 1978. Okay, so to understand Orientalism, we need to backtrack a little bit. So we did world systems theory. I know you're probably tired of hearing about world systems theory and global capitalism and all this stuff, but this is kind of foundational stuff for contemporary cultural anthropology. So if you remember, so just to backtrack, world systems theory took the concept of the relations of production, which is from Marxism, and then applies that to the relationship between the West and the developing world. So first world, third world. And what Wolff, drawing on the two economists I mentioned Andre Gunder Frank and Emmanuel Wallerstein, he took their work and applied it to anthropology and saying that, we're looking at poverty in these other parts of the world and totally separating it from anything that we've done, right? That these people over there are poor because they can't save money, or they're poor because they're lazy, or they're poor because they're too religious. But what Wolff's work did in anthropology was bring in these ideas from economics and say that, hey, we're all part of the same capitalist world system. They're just at a different location, and you can't understand their poverty without understanding the West's wealth, right? So starting with imperialism and what Wolf said was that started with imperialism, but we developed by extracting surplus value from the developing world in terms of labor and natural resources. So this is basic Marxism, but taken beyond national borders. It's more of a global system. And so what Wolf argued was that this is the Wolf and the economists whose work he drew on argued is that this is the economic base of global capitalism, and it entangles everybody, every region, every village. So, to quote Clifford Geertz, right? We don't study villages. We anthropologists don't study villages. We study in villages. Those villages are just as much a part of the capitalist world system as New York and Paris and Tokyo are, right? They're just in a different location. And so Wolf argued that we should establish an anthropology of connections. Okay, I think I went too far forward. Okay, let me go back a little bit. Okay, so world systems theory. So if Marxism is the framework, and this is why I backtracked here, if Marxism is the framework, then there should be an economic base and an ideological superstructure, if you remember that part. So the economic base is global capitalism. What's the ideological superstructure? In very simplistic terms, I would say, and a lot of people may not put it this way, but this is a way of simplifying it, but it's a good way to understand Orientalism for starters. The answer to that would be Orientalism. So Orientalism could be understood for now as the ideological superstructure to the economic base of imperialism. So it's the cultural and ideological justifications and ways of naturalizing power relations, right, between between the developing world and the developed world. So it's what naturalizes okay, good way to put it. It's what naturalizes the relations of production in global capitalism, and so what Said talked about was, how did this come to be, like, and how deep does this go? So this is what the power of Said's work and why it caused so much controversy in academia is he's taking these post-structuralist principles and he's saying that they go to the core of academic scholarship, that everything we think we know about China, Japan, India, the Middle East, a lot of it is just based on these cultural productions and stereotypes between the conquerors and the conquered. That, all the way back, if you remember, to race manifest destiny, right? We thought we had overcome that because of science and because of modernity and because of we have modern academic theories and methods and all these other things. Well, what Said was saying is that a lot of these theories in psychology, anthropology, sociology that we think we know about these other people are really just products of a very power-laden relationship and it doesn't include the voice of these other people. I talked about this a little bit in class while we were still in person, but it doesn't include the voice of the other, right? It's just people in the developing world talking about other people. And so, he's saying that it goes all the way through to the foundation. And so let's define it. My computer is a little bit slow. Okay. I don't know why. Okay, there we go. Okay, so definition of Orientalism. Okay, so it was the term itself came from Said in his 1978 book. And so this is, the historical moment when Oriental became a pejorative term when it referred to people of Asian descent or Middle Eastern descent. That now, you hear people say Oriental. You can say that about a rug, but you can't say that about people anymore. It's a little bit different in Europe. There were still departments of Oriental studies in the UK and things like that, but it became kind of a loaded term after Said's book. And so his way of definition, and I've got some typos here. Okay, so a brief definition, and you'll see Sally in the video at the end of this talk about it a little bit. So it's a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the. Why did I keep reading Ortitent? Anyway, okay, hold on. Sorry about that. I don't know why that. Okay, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient has helped define Europe, or the West, or the Occident, however you want to refer to the West, as Europe's contrasting image, idea, and personality. And so that's going to be a big thing. Like it's going to be a recurring thing that it's an image. If you wanted to pare this down a little bit, the Orient is an idea more than anything, and there's not a direct relationship between theories about what came to be known as the Orient, and there's no one-to-one relationship between the word and the world, right? If you want to talk about Foucault, I talked about it, kind of called into question the relationship between the word and the world. The word would be representation of how we talk about how do we make images, and the world would be actual reality. So Said's work does that as well. So what he's going to say about Orientalism is that it is a cultural industry that supports this relationship where the first world exploits the third world, right? So it's an idea, right? So he referred to it as a culture industry that produced key narratives and tropes about the relationship between East and West, between developed world and the developing world. And it's just basically, it created these ideas and stereotypes, or just drew on stereotypes and then kind of wrapped them in science and research and fieldwork and all these other things and called it truth, right? But again, it didn't include their voices. You didn't really talk to them. And I'll talk about how this happens later. For now, I'll just say that his study was very controversial, but it revolutionized the way cultural anthropologists understand the relationship between capitalism, imperialism, and culture. What is the relationship between these things that we call culture? Everything from academic scholarship to movies, art, film, poetry, literature, like all these different things. Like they're not just offshoots of reality. They actually help define reality, and that's kind of the key to this, is that if you use that matrix as a metaphor again, the matrix as a metaphor is still helpful in this situation, right? Because it's basically saying we are kind of prisoners to these stereotypes and things, and it hurts everybody. It doesn't just hurt the people in the developing world, it hurts us too, because there's so much that we could build together with those other people. So in a sense, Orientalism can be understood as the superstructure to imperialism as a mode of production. Okay, I already said that. All right, so the Orient then is part of Europe's material history, civilization, and culture. So Said makes this point that you can't understand the history of the West without understanding its relationship to the Orient, and the Orient will refer to different places. And I'll talk about that later. So Orientalism expresses and represents that part culturally and even ideologically as a mode of discourse, with supporting institutions, with like universities, supporting scholarships, research, right? Supporting imagery and doctrines, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail. And even supporting colonial bureaucracies and styles. And so again, it's all these ways that institutions define reality for humans. Like most of our human experience is filtered through some kind of institution or another. Scholarship, more than anything else, scholarship creates new terminology. It's a language. It's a way of, if you ever go to graduate school, and even as an undergrad, like part of your education in the liberal arts is basically just teaching you new language. That's also true in science and engineering. You're learning a new language because these terms describe things that you didn't know before you learned them, right? And so you need new terms. You need to learn new terms that represent these complex ideas. And so, I've talked before when I was discussing Stuart Hall's work that, like language, it really does define reality for us in a lot of ways. And so there's supporting scholarship, there's imagery and doctrines, and then there's bureaucracies and styles. And these are some of the things that Said talked about in the book. And what happens, and this is true post-structuralism, is that it produces something called the Orient. So remember, and I'll keep reminding you of this, in Foucault and post-structuralism, power is productive. It makes stuff, right? Power, we live in it, but it also, and it's between people, no one owns it, but it's through these power relationships that things get made, things are produced. And in this case, and this is why this is a really good example of post-structuralism, it produces something called the Orient. And it produces it as an object that can be understood as one that hasn't succeeded or hasn't become modern as fast as the West because of some kind of internal logic, right? So I talked about that with world systems. Why are those people so poor? What's wrong with them? Why can't they develop? Why doesn't why don't these other fledgling cities in the developing world look as wealthy as New York and Los Angeles? Why can't they pull this off like we have here in the U.S. and in Europe? Well, the answer to that is because we need to understand, because they're being exploited, right? Like that, the West buildup is happening through the extraction of resources from these other places. And so, yes, they do have different cultures. Yes, they may have cultures that impede certain kinds of development projects, but what social sciences failed to understand for most of the 20th century, and this is what Said argued, was that you can't put these villages in a vacuum and say and look at them and study them and see what happened without understanding their relationship to imperialism and colonialism. So, and I'll talk about hegemony a little bit later, but what this refers is this sustainable relationship where one entity has dominance over another and the cultural aspects of that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, and I say it here, I remember from Foucault, power is productive. It makes things. And in this case, in Said's study, it made the Orient. So, and so Said's book was one of the first really popular examples of post-structuralist thought and theory. The book illustrated how the production of knowledge is inseparable from the operation of power. That, and in fact, like to quote Foucault, the increase in power and knowledge are inseparable, and the increase of one is also automatically, immediately the increase of another. So the more knowledge you produce about a people, the more power you have over them. The more power you exercise over a group of people, the more knowledge you will collect about them, right? And so they're just automatic, they're inseparable. He puts them together with the slash power knowledge because it's, academia is about creating new language. Our language fails us here because we tend to see them separately, and that's what Foucault's trying to help us push past. Like, you can't separate them. In the interview at the end of this lecture, Said himself talks about, like when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he took archaeologists, he took philologists, he took biologists, he took linguists, he took all these people who just, the invasion was also accompanied by academic research because of course it was, right? And so, but then, Said will talk about in the interview how, the Egyptians couldn't do that to the French, right? And so, again, this is very controversial stuff. There's some people who still hate this kind of work because it gets at it kind of chips away at the heart of what anthropology is and what our project is. And so we've had to do a lot of work to kind of overcome this. But anyway, that's a digression. So, but again, Said's point, to hammer it home, I've already made it, I'll make it again. What we know about the Orient is inseparable from the relationship, which is exploitative, between the developed and developing world. These are not objective truths that we produce in academia. These are just products of an exploitative relationship. And so this was devastating to a lot of social sciences who had built their careers around objective science-based studies of non-Western people. It tore academia apart. I mean, it really did. And it's still controversial. It's more mainstream. It is the mainstream now, this view. But there are a lot of people, surviving from previous generations who, were like, "F you," like, let's say my work is stereotypes. But he did a lot of, Said proved very effectively that kind of some of these people, there's some useful information there, but don't act like you're not part of the imperial infrastructure, that you might as well be carrying a gun, is what he's saying, because Yeah. Anyway, okay. I don't want to go on. I want to keep this video as short as I can. So I'm not going to go on too many tangents. Okay. Okay, and so what he was arguing was that rather than objective truth, Orientalist texts, whether it's academic, film, music, literature, poetry, art, all these things, take the Orient and its people, this idea to be automatically the opposite of the West. And so as they were doing these things called imperialism and these things that we call imperialism and colonialism, as they were doing these things, they were basically just assuming that these people are the opposite. And yes, they would see radical cultural difference, but does that mean that they're the direct opposite of the self, right? Stuart Hall talks about this a little bit. So, in these texts, and I'll just group them all together and call them texts, we're talking about more than writing, we're talking about everything that we call cultural production. Some of the main things, this is not exclusive. I could make a mile long list of these things, but some of the main ones were that the West is masculine, the East is feminine. So that's where gender, these whole regions of the world would become gendered in these films, in these poems, in these literatures. And every stereotype that you can associate with masculinity and femininity becomes imposed on these regions of the world, right? So if it's masculine, remember the egg and the sperm. If the sperm is masculine, then the egg must be feminine. If America is masculine, then Guam or the Philippines must be feminine. And so no one would ever come out in their work and say that, but it's there. You just have to read it out of it. It's textual analysis. You just look at it and it's like, oh my God. In the same way that Emily Martin did this for biology and gender stereotypes, Said did this for, Said did this for what we just call movies, and looked at how they produce these things. So anyway, the West is rational, the East is superstitious. So the West is usually portrayed as rational and based on science and reality, whereas the East is superstitious and they believe in things that don't exist, and magic and things. And again, it's not that these things don't exist in the world. Yes, there are people in the developing world that that practice witchcraft or that believe in witchcraft and practice magic and things. Like that doesn't mean that's fundamentally who they are and that they're not capable of rational thought, right? So another thing in these films, the West is progressive, the East is culture bound and static, right? So the West expands. So again, remember, think of it as a superstructure for imperialism as a mode of production. The West is progressive, it expands, it goes on adventures, it solves problems, it doesn't. So sperm, right? Just like, so go back and look at that. If you haven't watched the lecture on Emily Martin and the sperm and the egg, I mean, it's shocking how, they're paralleled, right? So again, gender is part of this also. So the West is progressive, it's adventurous, and the East is culture bound, it's static, right? It's passive. It just wants to continue its traditions, and without the intervention of Western imperialism, they would never freaking change. Like they would just stay there, and they would just keep having their Chinese New Year's and their Tet and Tet as Vietnamese New Year's, or do on all these quote unquote weird things in the Middle East and praying all the time and all this stuff. What is all this stuff? So it's basically, so I'm making it sound stereotypical, which it is, but if you take that and you wrap it in science, then it just sounds like fact, right? So but the thing to remember is that these things that academically become validated as truths, they exclude the voice of the other, which is the Orient, right? And are based on projections and historical domination, hegemony, right? So power relationships, they are grounded in power, like these truths. Foucault once said that, post-structuralists once said that, I don't know if it was Foucault directly, but that all knowledge is positioned, right? There's no innocence. And so what Said's work represented was a loss of innocence in academia, that he indicted all of social science who did work about other parts of the world and saying, like, you are complicit with domination. Your knowledge that you're producing and that's being stamped with a PhD or with an MA or with a bachelor's degree, whatever your degree is being validated by the institution, not by science, right? Not by truth. It's not just because your institution says that you are producing objective knowledge, that doesn't mean that's true, right? So again, really ground shaking in academia. And again, just as a side note here, like what the Orient refers to, and you hear me shifting between different countries, because y'all have grown up, your generation has thankfully grown up not with these stereotypes about Orientalism and things like so. This you live in a post-Said world, so this isn't familiar with to you. But when I was growing up in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, yeah, it was all the time. People would just say Oriental guy, Oriental person, or the Orient. Thankfully, your generation hasn't grown up with these ideas, but in general, and you'll see this in the literature, if someone's from England, when they say the Orient, they would mean India, the Middle East, China. If it's France, they're usually talking about Algeria, North Africa, Morocco, other places in the Middle East. So that's what when they say, oh, exotic vacation in the Orient, they would usually be referring to this area. Americans, and this is something you may have a feel for this, but usually if it's an American speaking and they would say the Orient, they would be talking about East Asia, especially China and Japan. It all depends on where your colonial exploits and your imperialist expeditions were, right? So, because of one of the tricks of Orientalist scholarship is to study these places and represent them as being totally separate from us, right? They're so opposite from us because there's a distance, because they're unconnected, and nothing could be further from the truth. You can't understand England. There's nothing when you think about. So here's a little mental exercise. Think about, what do English people drink? Your answer to that was probably tea, right? Americans drink coffee. Americans tend to drink coffee. The British still have their tea time. Where do they get their tea from? They get their tea from India. They have been getting their tea from India for a long time. So even this one little symbol, that's just nothing more British than having a 4 o'clock tea and biscuits, right? But that right there goes to show you that India has played, their colonial exploits in India have had a lot to do with like what later became Englishness. So, okay, so same thing with Americans and ours, and a lot of other things. So I won't go through this list, but I just wanted to point out that what people refer to as the Orient, which place they refer to depends on what country they're from. Okay, so here's some key ideas. Okay, so I talked about what is Orientalism, and so that's a definition. But okay, so what about the content of these cultural texts that Said talked about? There's some other ideas, but I'd like to save time just by boiling it down to just a couple of key ideas. These are some of the most important ones. One is that the Oriental will identify with power. That they will submit. That hierarchy is so important to them that it's not. So again, ideological superstructures naturalize power relations. So if I'm dominating someone, I want to see it as natural that our relationship of domination, same thing. You've seen this before. You saw it with race in the Americas, right? In the Americas, the first generation of anthropologists were trying to prove what's inferior about people of African descent, because it justifies the domination. It justifies the slavery, right? So same thing with Orientalism. So these social scientists, these anthropologists, sociologists, archaeologists, psychologists, like they just bent over backwards and use science to do it, to show that the Oriental will identify with power, so that it's okay. And they wouldn't think of it this way, but basically what that functions to do is to show that it's okay for me to dominate them. It's okay for me to exploit them, because they don't know what they're doing with those resources anyway. They will submit to you because that's their nature. And again, you'll see this in the next slide. Like you've seen these tropes, we call them, these ideas in these kind of foundational ideas in literature and film and things like that. So that's one, the idea that they all identify with power. And the other one, and this is, both of these are way bigger than I'm saying here, but another key idea is that the Orient and its people are culture bound and static. I mentioned this before a little bit, but they don't change, and anytime, you still see it in documentaries, like for thousands of years, the fill in the blank people have practiced this. No, they haven't. And that's a way, it's a very irresponsible way to represent human lives too, because no one's culture has gone unchanged for thousands of years. Culture doesn't work that way. Human behavior doesn't work that way. And so to create this fiction that they haven't, again, that absolves you of colonialism. You're basically, I've recently seen in political debates, some places, people of certain political perspectives argue that slavery was okay because it brought a lot of Africans into modernity, and so they should be thankful for that. That's one of those things, like those people would have never changed if we didn't come in and do this to them, and so it's okay. So even though we did some bad stuff in the past, we don't do that stuff anymore, and that, hey, aren't you better off than you used to be back when you lived in huts, right? So I mean, I see this on Twitter all the time, like people make that argument. But Said was, made that argument here that those people are culture bound. They're not capable of development. They wouldn't change. They need to be taught these things. And so, so those are the two key ideas. They'll identify with power. Those of you old enough to remember September 11th and the aftermath, the wars that started in Iraq, the idea, Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney, before they decided to invade Iraq, for no apparent reason other than to get the oil. Anyway, don't even get me started. Like when Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Bush decided to invade Iraq, the first thing Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense, came out and said was that they were going to hit them. The strategy was shock and awe, right? That they called it shock and awe. And we say that now. This is where the phrase was first popularized, right? They said that the Iraqis would see that we're so powerful that they will submit, right? They will submit when they see how strong we are. If that doesn't sound like an abusive relationship, I don't know what does, right? That if I show them how strong I am, they will immediately submit, and then I can do what I want with them and get what I need, right? So, think about how these things kind of can go back between global politics, personal relationships, American history with slavery, things like that. And so, he gave a press conference and saying that when we invade them and bomb the shit out of them, they will submit and the war will be over. We can finish this thing in about a week, right? And so how long have we been there? What has it been, 19 years now? They really did. They promised that war would be over in a matter of weeks, and it's been 19 years. It's just this assumption that those people won't fight for what they believe in, and that this is just the progress of history, and my invasion of your country is inevitable. So you might as well just lay your gun down and submit because I'm a good guy, right? So you'll see these things in the literature. And then the other one that is culture bound. One of my favorite scenes in the movie Full Metal Jacket is when, people, I'll save that for a future thing. But basically there's a scene in which, if you don't know the history of the Tet, T-E-T, the Tet offensive in Vietnam, you can look that up. But it was when, I think I mentioned this in class, that there was a ceasefire for Vietnamese New Year's, negotiated during the Vietnam War, and the U.S. government just assumed that they would not fight during this war because New Year's is so important to those people that even this life or death struggle against American and European forces would not interrupt with Chinese New Year's. And what happened was the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attacked every American base during Vietnamese New Year's because the U.S. let his guard down. They just assumed that they wouldn't fight during New Year's. But even though they violated a ceasefire, but in other situations, the American military would, you still need to be on your guard even during a negotiated ceasefire. So, and there's a scene in there where, a military reporter saying, like, those people will be so busy worshiping their dead ancestors and barking at the moon that there's no way they're going to fight. And they did. So it's one of those things that they're so constrained by culture and tradition that they're not capable of having modern ideas even, right? And so you see these things in literature. I won't go on about these. You see them in these films. So here's some examples. It's the same story over and over, and I'll talk about how they're the same story. So all the way back to Shogun in 1980. I mean, even before that, and you'll see an example of this with M. Butterfly kind of rewrite some of these stories. Shogun in 1980. That one I've never seen. Dances with Wolves, 1990. So this story, Hollywood loves this story and they tell it over and over again, and people just eat it up. We all buy tickets. I've seen three of these movies before. I barely remember Dances with Wolves. I should watch that again. I don't know. But I definitely, I just showed my kids Avatar, Last Samurai I saw when I was in grad school. And my anthropology grad student friends, we loved it. And The Last Samurai is a great movie unless you just hate Tom Cruise, which I dig it. I get it. But it's a great film, but it's disturbing that all the ideas I just talked about, they come up, and Hollywood loves it. So you've got everything. So from Shogun to Dances with Wolves to Avatar to The Last Samurai, they're telling the same story. So look at the image, right? Look at, it's, and I'll show you. Okay, so what story are they telling? Okay, so Dances with Wolves. Dances with Wolves, these are all in different historical periods. They're in different decades. They're in different regions, different parts of the world. And yet here they are. How can you get the same story when you're talking about different people? All right. So what story are they telling? What these films have in common? It's always a damaged, marginal white guy. Check, check, check. They're all the same. Either alcoholic. So let's go back. Damaged white guy. Dances with Wolves, alcoholic. Avatar, alcoholic and paraplegic. Paraplegic, alcoholic. Last Samurai, PTSD, alcoholic. Shogun, I don't know. I'm not familiar with Shogun, but we can just assume it's the same story. And so again, why do they always start there? It has to be so it doesn't. It's almost like these films go out of their way to prove to you that there's nothing special about the white man who's about to conquer this other part of the world, like just through the power of his spirit. So, you can tie this back to Dyer too, with all this stuff about whiteness and adventurism, right? So these films go out of their way to show you that there's nothing, these aren't even average white dudes. These are below average white dudes. And yet they do these amazing things you're about to see. There's nothing super about them, right? So, all right, so they always started with a damaged, marginal white guy, right? He ends up in the Orient, either kidnapped or goes there, gets abandoned, shipwrecked in Shogun. I think Shogun starts with a shipwreck. He ends up in 17th century Japan. He learns their ways, right? Even though in films like The Last Samurai and also in Avatar, it's always the other people saying like, let's capture this person and learn about the ways they fight or learn about these other people. But in the end, it's like the whole movie is just them teaching him how their ways, right? And it's like, yeah, what about? I thought you were supposed to be learning about American military strategy, but why are you teaching him? In The Last Samurai, for example, like, why are you teaching him all these Bushido samurai skills and things? Like, you're not learning anything about American military. Okay, so he learns their ways, and it's always unrealistically fast. Tom Cruise learns Japanese and how to be a samurai in a year. Bullshit. There's no way that's possible. Anyway, so he masters their ways, and not only does he masters the things that they do, he becomes the best among them. And so again, we've gone from damaged, marginal white guy to he's better at so he's better at being whatever they are than they are. So, oops. So I'll just pick these two I'm most familiar with: Last Samurai and Avatar. So Jake Scully in Avatar becomes, he rides that. I forgot what that thing was called, but he rides that giant flying thing that no one, only once in a couple thousand years does anyone ever ride that thing, and he becomes their unquestioned leader because of his bravery. He's not the official leader of the Na'vi, but they start following him because he rides this thing and he leads the rebellion against the other people. Last Samurai, Tom Cruise is the last one. The Last Samurai group gets mowed down by Gatling guns. He's the only one who survives, right? And Ken Watanabe, the Japanese co-star, like the a kind of a co-star, the real leader of the samurai, like asks him for permission to die, to commit suicide on the battlefield. And then Tom Cruise basically becomes the last samurai, and he goes to the emperor and says like, just don't forget, you have all this modern stuff, but don't forget who you really are. So the samurai sword, and he gives them that guy's samurai sword, and the emperor's like, whatever, like, and so, but we the viewer share Tom Cruise's moral high ground that Japan should not be doing all this modern stuff. It should be itself. It should be traditional, right? So anyway, all right. So he learns their ways, he masters their ways, he kind of becomes their leader. He always marries a native woman. It always has to be sexualized because it kind of puts a bow on the present. It kind of puts the icing on the cake, that to sexualize this power relationship between the West and East, you need to embody it in a romantic coupling. In The Last Samurai is the most outrageous example, because when Tom Cruise gets kidnapped by the samurai, the first battle, the reason they kidnap him is that he doesn't know any martial arts or anything, but he's a scrappy fighter, and they like his spirit. And he's such a scrappy fighter, and they realize this because he kills one of the samurai who attacked his modern Japanese army that he was trying to train. Like, he was trying to train the Japanese army to fight in a Western way, and they run away, of course, when they first encounter the samurai, because they're so scared of samurai. Again, they're culture bound. They're, oh my God, they're terrified. You're sitting there with a gun and you're running away from samurai, which is, and I guess that is kind of rational. But Tom Cruise, being the guy in this film, like he stays and fights, and he kills one of the samurai. But anyway, my main point, he ends up marrying the wife of the samurai he killed before he converted to being a samurai, which just doesn't make any sense. The village head, the samurai head forces the guy's widow to take care of him, and she resents it at first, but she's drawn to him, of course, right? And so they end up married. Similar relationship here. She's not a widow, but she is forced to take care of him and train him, and they fall in love, of course. They always do. Yeah. So I don't know. You can check these other two movies to see if the same thing plays out, but probably, right? So, and then he saves the community from the bad whites in search of more land or resources. So again, and this is what's slick about Orientalist narratives, is that it's always, we like these stories because we can leave feeling good about it, right? Jake Scully in Avatar, he saves them. He saves the Na'vi. I mean, yeah, those people destroy those. The Earthlings destroy the Na'vi's home tree, but then they eventually they'll find another one if we ever see these sequels. But like, they find another one, but they are brought to justice by him, and so we leave feeling good that, yeah, okay. So despite all this other stuff we saw, the fact that the white guy protects them from the other bad, white people, basically, that the fact that he protects them from them makes us leave feeling good. And so this is all natural, but this guy is special. He doesn't have any superpowers. He's a damaged person, right? He's not even one of the better ones, right? So anyway, so we leave feeling good, and so we don't feel like we've seen anything that doesn't fit reality, right? Okay, so how does this happen? How do these ideas become reality for people? Well, I talked about this in class once, the self-referentiality of texts. Like, basically, when you get validated as a person with a PhD, you're mastering a literature more than you are talking to the people you're writing about. And then I'm talking about things like international studies and anthropology, right? Where I'm going to do field work in China. Well, for example, your committee is going to make you read all these books and articles about China, everything that's ever been published about it, and then you have to master it, and you have to come up with questions, and then you write it. And so basically, in some ways, that's more work than field work. And so, but the main point here is that you have been, I won't say brainwashed, that's a terrible term, but you have been conditioned in a way so that everything you discover when you actually go to the field has already been filtered through that literature. And in fact, they won't let you write a thesis or a dissertation that doesn't match what you saw in those literatures, right? That even the questions you ask people when you're interviewing them, you may think you're talking to them, but you're framing the conversation, right? Everything you do is framed. The questions you ask have already been predicted. You already have an idea of what the answers. Your advisors, your thesis committee has already decided what they will accept for an answer. And so if you come back with something different, unless you really work hard to prove that you have discovered something new, it's going to be framed in terms of that literature. And so basically, Said demonstrated that these things they get grounded, they become validated as scientifically true just because of the institution is stamping this PhD on it, right? So it's the institution that makes it true, not the research, right? So, and it excludes the voices of the Orient. I mentioned that before, and it misrepresents the relationship between truth and representation. These representations of The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves, Avatar, Shogun, they become true for people because like, oh, it's so historically accurate. And they do work with historians and anthropologists to make some of these films to make sure that they're accurate, right? But then what do you mean by accurate? Well, accurate means it tracks the things that you read in the literature. Well, where does the literature come from? Well, other literatures. And so again, it's like that's where the idea for the matrix comes from, right? It's, there are a lot of people who think they know something about Japan because they saw The Last Samurai and they watched the documentary that talked about how historically accurate it was. I could say the same thing about, like all kinds of other films. So think about where does truth, what is the foundation of truth and knowledge? Right. So again, we're falling back on post-structuralism and Foucault. His work was about epistemology. How do you know what you know? Right. So I could, Memoirs of a Geisha. If we were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hands. How many people have seen or read Memoirs of a Geisha, like the original novel or the film that was made out of it? It was written by a white guy. It was 10 years ago when I learned that. I knew the book was out there. I never read it, but that's another thing people read. It's like, wow, Japan is so interesting. It's like, what the hell does a white guy know about what it's like to be a geisha, and why is he writing this book? And who the hell are you? And so it's just a weird thing that we just take these things to be truth and we believe them, right? Okay. All right, so these are some of the things. So this misrepresenting of this relationship between truth and representation, that's what tore academia apart. Because what Said and the other post-structuralists are arguing is that representations are just language games and stereotypes, and they're mirror image projections onto other people. They're not based on reality, right? So, okay. So I'm going to end there, and we can take these principles. You can go back and look at some of these slides and just kind of try to get a sense for what Said was arguing. So Soot Jolly's slide, his film, this excerpt from a documentary, it's only about 6 minutes. It's only 6.5 minutes, but it's Said explaining his work. And then, so in the next lecture, I'll cover how Kondo applies the concept of Orientalism to an anti-Orientalist stage play in Butterfly. I would highly suggest reading that before. Kondo's article is a little difficult to read, I'll be honest, but it's the best. It's a really good exploration of how to apply post-structuralist ideas to the study of identity, because the subtitle of her article is "In Butterfly is a Critique of Essentialist Identity." It's written as a way to argue with this idea that Asian people, or especially East Asian people in her case, in her cases, but a relationship between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and France, between the two projects, how these big geopolitical battles and structures like imperialism and capitalism can permeate even personal relationships, so that people play these parts, right? Remember from No Logo, Klein talked about how we're given menu choices for certain things. And so this is a good way to think about this too, that a lot of who we are, as me, myself, I'm a black man, or if you are an Asian Asian person who identifies as female or male, there are all these different things, like it's this matrix of cultural productions called Orientalism kind of, it can influence ourselves and how we see ourselves and how we relate to other people. And so kind of it's really interesting. So it's worth the work to put into it, and I will walk you through it in the next lecture. But it's a fun thing to read. So all right, so I'm gonna stop here and then show the video. So I'm gonna get out of this, and I'll just embed the video in this video, and I'll just show you from here if I can pull it up. Let's see. All right, so I've got that here, and I'll just play that. I'll just put it here so that you don't have to look for it. All right, so I'll just leave it.
Orientalism tries to answer the question of why, when we think of the Middle East, for example, we have a preconceived notion of what kind of people live there, what they believe, how they act, even though we may never have been there or indeed even met anyone from there. More generally, Orientalism asks, how do we come to understand people, strangers, who look different to us by virtue of the color of their skin? The central argument of Orientalism is that the way we acquire this knowledge is not innocent or objective, but the end result of a process that reflects certain interests. That is, it is highly motivated. Specifically, Said argues that the way the West, Europe and the US, looks at the countries and peoples of the Middle East is through a lens that distorts the actual reality of those places and those people. He calls this lens through which we view that part of the world Orientalism, a framework that we use to understand the unfamiliar and the strange, to make the peoples of the Middle East appear different and threatening. Professor Said's contribution to how we understand this general process of what we could call stereotyping has been immense. The aim of this program is to explore these issues through an interview with him.
If somebody, let's say in the 1850s or 60s in Paris or London, wished to talk about or read about India or Egypt or Syria, there would be very little chance for that person to simply address the subject, as we like to think, in a kind of free and creative way. A great deal of writing had gone before, and this writing was an organized form of writing, like an organized science, what I've called Orientalism. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, the sensual woman who's there to be sort of used by the man. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters. The marvels of the East was a phrase that was used. And the more I looked, the more I saw that this was really quite consistent with itself. It had very little to do with people who had actually been there. And even if they had been there, there wasn't much modification. In other words, you didn't get what you could call realistic representations of the Orient, either in literature or in painting or in music or any of the arts. And this extended even further into descriptions of the Arabs by experts, people who had studied them. And I noticed that even in the 20th century, some of the same images that you found in the 19th century, amongst scholars like Edward William Lane, who wrote his book on the modern Egyptians in the early 1830s, and then you read somebody in the 1920s, and they're more or less saying the same thing. So there develops a kind of image of the timeless Orient, as if the Orient, unlike the West, doesn't develop. It stays the same. And that's one of the problems with Orientalism, is it creates an image outside of history, of something that is placid and still and eternal, which is simply contradicted by the facts of history. You see, so in that one sense, it's a creation of you might say an ideal other for Europe.
Professor Said's analysis of Orientalism isn't just a description of its content, but a sustained argument for why it looks the way it does. It's an examination of the quite concrete historical and institutional context that creates it. Specifically, Said locates the construction of Orientalism within the history of imperial conquest. As empires spread across the globe, historically the British and the French have been the most important in terms of the East, they conquer not only militarily, but also what we could call ideologically. The question for these empires is, how do we understand the natives that we are encountering so we can conquer and subdue them easier? This process of using large abstract categories to explain people who look different, whose skin is a different color, has been going on for a long time, as far back as there has been contact between different cultures and peoples. But Orientalism makes this general process more formal in that it presents itself as objective knowledge. Said identifies Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1798 as marking a new kind of imperial and colonial conquest that inaugurates the project of Orientalism.
There was a kind of break that occurred after Napoleon came to Egypt in 1798. I think it's the first really important modern imperial expedition. So he invades the place, but he doesn't invade it the way the Spaniards invaded the New World, looking for loot. He comes instead with an enormous army of soldiers, but also scientists, botanists, architects, philologists, biologists, historians, whose job it was to record Egypt in every conceivable way and produce a kind of scientific survey of Egypt, which was designed not for the Egyptian, but for the European. And, of course, what strikes you, first of all, about the volumes that they produced is their enormous size. They're a meter square. And all across them is written the power and prestige of a modern European country that can do to the Egyptians what the Egyptians cannot do to the French. I mean, there's no comparable Egyptian survey of France. To produce knowledge, you have to have the power to be there and to see in expert ways things that the natives themselves can't see.
What's going on?
Okay, that's the end of that. All right, so I will see you in the next lecture. All right, take care and stay safe. Wash your hands, don't touch your faces, and hopefully we'll all be back on campus next semester. But yeah, so check the syllabus. We will have some live discussions. I'm about to log on to Zoom now for office hours. All right, see you in a bit.